The world is in the midst of a significant energy transition, moving toward more sustainable, lower carbon sources of energy. In Alaska, this transition also reflects a growing interest in diversifying our energy portfolio to rely more on local resources such as wind, hydropower, and solar energy. Some of Alaska's rural communities have really been leading the way in this energy transition, but the Railbelt electric grid, which is where about 80% of Alaskans get their electric power from, still relies heavily on natural gas. As gas resources in Cook Inlet are declining and the era of cheap gas is drawing to a close, there's a growing interest in diversifying our generation sources.
We're receptive to all sorts of different types of energy. Our dependence on fossil fuels, one time served us well because we had abundant resources, that sort of stuff. But the challenges of gas and Cook Inlet have really underscored the fact that we need diversification. We have to have energy diversity. And if you can have renewable energy that's added, that the initial cost of it is high once you get the infrastructure, but after that it's lower cost and cleaner energy.
In navigating this energy transition, it makes sense for Alaska to look for lessons learned from other similar places that have paved a path that we might be able to follow. In the continental United States, the only single state grid that we could turn to as an analog is in Texas, and that grid is 2 orders of magnitude bigger in terms of the load it serves. So there's limitations on the lessons that we can learn from there. Alaska is pretty unique in that it's not electrically interconnected with either Canada or the lower 48, and it's pretty tiny in terms of the load and the population it serves, while being really big geographically. And when you think about it, Iceland is really similar in that it's not just due to demographic and geographic similarities. It's also because Iceland's energy market has evolved in a way that's pretty analogous to the Railbelt. When Iceland was originally electrified, it started out in the larger towns and cities with municipal utilities that operated independently using a combination of small local hydroelectric power and diesel-based generation. Over time, these independent municipal utilities were interconnected to become part of Iceland's ring grid. And that ring grid isn't too different in length and population served than the Railbelt grid.
Historically, when the Railbelt utilities were formed, we weren't connected. We were these isolated utilities formed to take care of ourselves. And that made perfect sense then. But today it doesn't. And I would describe the system as fragile, undersized, it lacks redundancy, and it's extremely vulnerable. There's so many single points of failure because it's essentially, to describe it is essentially to describe a series of different size connection cords or extension cords all the way from Homer up to Fairbanks. And so you're only as strong as the weakest link.
Interconnecting communities through a regional transmission network, whether it's in Alaska's Railbelt or in Iceland, means that you can invest in larger, more cost-effective generation that takes advantage of economies of scale. This enables you to share the power produced from those resources across the whole region. But to do that, you need to have a robust, modern transmission infrastructure with built-in redundancy, and how you actually operate and manage that system is actually equally important to the physical infrastructure itself. That transmission system is absolutely the backbone that you need in order to start investing in new generation that's centered on local resources. For Iceland, that new generation was large-scale hydroelectric and geothermal power, which allowed them to become energy independent, at least when it comes to electricity and heat production.
First, to learn and to see what a country that's half the size of Alaska, with significantly less resources, was able to achieve. And what they were able to achieve by focusing on their electric system, which is primarily their transmission. They were able to ensure that the lowest cost electron went where it was. And by focusing on their electric system, they literally transformed a nation.
Exactly. And that is a transition that happens with, Iceland. This is also a story of independence. We were becoming independent from Denmark, and we became fully independent in 1944. It was a question of how can we use our energy resources to build diversity for our economy.
For Iceland, energy independence was closely tied to economic development. Historically, Iceland was one of the poorest countries in Europe. Its biggest export a century ago was its fisheries because it had no other natural resources like mineral wealth or timber or fossil fuels.
I'm also from this area in the southeast where things developed. We went to my grandmother's farm where she was born. My grandmother has passed away, but her brother was telling the story. It's an isolated farm. When he and his father built this small dam in this little river, and when light came to that place and heat came to that little farm, and just how, it was a big revolution for the livelihood of people, and it was such a vivid memory of bam, a transition. So that's how it started. Then the electrification continues. We have the bigger power plants coming in later on, mostly in the context of attracting aluminum industry.
Economic development often goes hand in hand with access to affordable, reliable energy, and that's definitely true for Iceland. Iceland had to come up with a creative way to build up a modern economy, and that meant striking a deal with the aluminum industry. Aluminum smelting is incredibly energy intensive, and by building up excess generation that could be used to power those aluminum smelters, Iceland was able to find a creative way to export its energy in ways other than through pipelines or transmission lines. Today, Iceland is one of the most energy-intensive countries on the planet, selling 5 times more power annually than all of the Railbelt utilities combined, despite having a pretty similar domestic load. That excess power is used to serve heavy industries, but in addition to serving as an economic backbone for the country, the energy-intensive industries create a side benefit. By producing way more power and then spreading the cost of that power generation across many more sales, everyone pays a little bit less per unit of electricity that's sold. And that means that the average cost of power in Iceland is only around 10 cents, which is less than half of what we pay on a Railbelt, and that's been a boon for Iceland's economic growth.
Iceland did it, and it wasn't easy. It took some 20 years to complete the process, but today you see the benefit, and it's everywhere in Iceland. It's 2 cents a kilowatt for industrial power, it's 7 cents for residential rates, and that's where we need to be as Alaska if we're going to grow our economy.
What Iceland is perhaps best known for is the use of its geothermal resources. Iceland's lucky because it's located on a mid-Atlantic rift where the crust is really thin, and that means it has easy access to geothermal resources across a large portion of its geography. Iceland generates about 20% of its electric power from geothermal resources, but where geothermal really comes in is for space heating. Nearly every home and business in Iceland is heated with geothermal hot water through thousands of wells that have been drilled and hundreds of individual district heating systems that distribute that hot water to almost every single residence, farm, and business in the country.
Yeah, so it is a story of entrepreneurship. I think that's my favorite part of that story. Just like with hydropower, you had farmers that kind of led the way. There was a farmer here in a neighboring municipality, Mosfellsbær, who found a way to connect his farm to a neighboring hot spring. And then more did the same. The municipalities noticed. And then the first drilling for geothermal happened in Reykjavik in 1928. And importantly, these projects were used to heat key buildings, a public school and a public hospital. And I think that really helped the transition because people could see that the technology worked.
For Iceland, a lot of these investments made in building out energy infrastructure have become part of a virtuous cycle of economic development, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And geothermal is a really good example of that. Cheap geothermal space heating has been a boon for local food production, with hot water used to heat greenhouses year-round, driving a thriving food production sector. Today, Iceland has hundreds of greenhouses and produces over 50% of the food consumed on the island locally.
So if we kind of look at our energy mix and kind of continue to focus on the electricity piece, 5% of our electricity is consumed by homes. Then we have about 15% that is consumed by, traditional businesses, smaller businesses. But the heavy industry is almost 80% of our consumption of the electricity here.
Governor Dunleavy said where you see a lack of tower cranes shows a lack of economic viability. In downtown Reykjavik, everywhere you look in any direction, you see a tower crane. And that's because of one thing, and that's cheap electricity.
What was incredible to me is that, there's so much similarity between Iceland and Alaska, in terms of, look at Alaska, the outmigration of Alaska residents is huge. Iceland had a similar issue, and yet now the young people, they may go out for education, but they are coming back. That economy is thriving. The fact that you talk to the Minister of Energy or anybody within the government, they're concerned that the rate of economic growth is accelerating so fast that they've got to be careful about too hot of an economy.
Yes, we are exporting electricity, not through a cable like is done in many other countries, but through products. So by exporting aluminum, we are exporting electricity. And the same you could say in many ways about data centers, for an example, that operate here, because they are, in some ways a way to export electricity.
I mean, that's just incredible. And yet you come back to Alaska and you see that we have this unbelievable potential, but we haven't realized it. And for me, the thing that was the biggest revelation was the fact that by having a vision and having a sustained commitment to that vision and the resources that can apply to achieve that vision, they transformed a nation in literally 10 years. And the question that I ask is, why can't we?
There's risk, and you can't really say in Iceland that it was not decided on day one to do all of these projects to transform the country in this way, but it's built on the first stepping stones. So, it may be difficult to advocate for a new infrastructure or, really build it. Maybe it's not the most, best projects for politicians or whatever. But if you look over time, we are still reaping the benefits of these decisions made decades ago, showing us the value of, really looking ahead when you're picking what type of infrastructure you want to develop for resilience communities.
Can you imagine if we did this in Alaska, working together to increase our base load and our renewable portfolio to lower the cost of energy to all Alaskans, working together to attract industry into this state and add value to our export industry as well?
The first step is you've got to identify what the needs are. Then what you have to do is you have to develop a vision that is communicated and embraced, and be patient. Nothing gets achieved overnight. And as we spoke to many of the people in Iceland, it was a bumpy road.
For every energy transition, countries have different paths, but the beauty is in the expertise that is built along and how you can enhance that and create value of it for society.
This is an investment for the future of Alaska. Pure and simple. It's cheap electricity.